In the bustling interspecies trading hub of Nexus Station, Tahoe fidgeted with his formal trading robes as he waited in the dimly lit transaction chamber. The air smelled of various alien species and the metallic scent of credit exchanges. His forearms were crossed tightly against his chest, his blue skin looking pale even in the amber lighting. Behind him stood Minji, his youngest daughter. She was barely an adult by Verlaxian standards, her slender blue form trembling slightly though she fought to hide it. Her 4 eyes, 2 large primary ones and 2 smaller secondary ones above them, were fixed on the floor. She wore a simple gray shift, the traditional garment of those being transferred in debt contracts. "Stand straight," Tahoe hissed without turning. "The human will be here soon. Do not embarrass our family further." Minji straightened her posture but said nothing. There was nothing to say. Her family's gambling debts had mounted beyond recovery. The solution had been simple in her father's eyes: trade the youngest daughter to clear the ledger. Verlaxian custom permitted it. Station law allowed it. Her opinion had never been sought. The door slid open with a soft hiss. A human male walked in, dressed in practical explorer's clothing rather than the flashy garments most traders wore. This was David Park, a researcher known for his fair dealings with non-humans. "You are punctual," Tahoe said, inclining his head slightly. "I appreciate efficiency in business." David's eyes moved past Tahoe to Minji. She noted how his gaze was different from other traders who had considered her father's offer. There was no evaluation of her physical form, no appraising look that measured her worth in labor potential. Instead, his eyes seemed to notice her fear. "Let's review the terms," David said, his voice measured and calm. He activated a holographic display between them. 4 standard years of contract labor to clear the debt of 50,000 credits owed to Jorax Trading Company. Tahoe nodded impatiently. Yes, the contract is standard. My daughter is trained in domestic duties and basic medical care. She understands human language and customs adequately." He spoke as if describing a piece of equipment rather than his child. David turned to Minji directly. "Do you understand the terms of this contract?" The question startled her. No one had asked her anything directly in weeks. She had been an object to be discussed, not a person to be addressed. "I understand," she said softly, her voice barely audible. David frowned and turned back to Tahoe. "I require her full consent to be recorded." Tahoe's upper arms twitched in annoyance. "This is unnecessary. By our customs, a family head speaks for all members." "Not by my customs," David replied firmly. "And as the contract holder, my customs apply here." Tahoe turned to glare at Minji. The message was clear: cooperate or face worse consequences. David approached Minji and held out a small recording device. "Please state your name and that you understand and accept the terms of this labor contract." Minji looked into the human's eyes. There was something there she had not expected. Respect, perhaps. "I am Minji of Clan Yun. I understand and accept the terms of this labor contract." "Thank you," David said, stepping back. He turned to Tahoe. "The full amount will be transferred upon completion of the biometric confirmation." Tahoe pressed his palm against the scanner without hesitation. The machine hummed, accepting his genetic signature. The debt transfer was displayed on the holographic screen, showing the immediate clearance of the family's massive debt. "The transaction is complete," Tahoe said, already turning to leave. He paused at the door, not quite looking back at his daughter. "Serve well. Do not bring shame." Then he was gone. Minji stood motionless, clutching her small bag of personal belongings. From daughter to property in the span of minutes, the finality of it washed over her like cold water. David approached her again, but maintained a respectful distance. "I know this is difficult," he said quietly, "but I want you to have this." He held out a small data chip. "This contains your contract terms, your legal rights under Federation law, and contact information for the Labor Rights Office on Nexus Station." Minji stared at the chip. No debt servant was typically given access to their own contract. "You may be working for me," David continued, But you remain a person with rights. I expect work, not servitude." She took the chip with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, not knowing what else to say. As they left the transaction chamber together, Minji noticed how different this felt from what she had feared. David walked beside her rather than ahead. He carried his own bags rather than loading her with them. When they passed other Verlaxians in the corridor, she saw their secondary eyes widen in surprise at how she was being treated. The ship waited in the docking bay, smaller and more practical than she had expected. Not the luxury vessel of a wealthy trader, but the working transport of a researcher. "It's a 3-week journey to Colony Epsilon," David explained as they boarded. "I've prepared quarters for you. You'll have privacy and your own communication access." Minji paused at the entrance to the ship. She looked back at Nexus Station one last time. Her family had sold her body to cover their debts, but something told her that this human might see more in her than just the labor her body could provide. With a deep breath, she stepped aboard to face whatever this new life might bring. The hum of the ship's engines created a constant background noise that Minji found oddly comforting as she sat in her private quarters. 3 days had passed since leaving Nexus Station, and she was still adjusting to her new reality. Her room was small but clean, with a sleeping platform, storage unit, and a small desk with a terminal, luxuries no debt servant would typically receive. A soft chime sounded at her door. "Minji, it's David. May I come in?" The request for permission was another surprise. She quickly straightened her simple clothing. "Yes, you may enter." The door slid open to reveal David holding a tray with food. "I thought we could review the research project while we eat. Are you hungry?" Minji nodded, watching as he set the tray on her desk. The meal consisted of foods compatible with Verlaxian biology, thoughtfully prepared. "You did not need to bring me food," she said softly. "I can eat in the common area." David shrugged. "I thought you might want some time to adjust before sharing meals in the common space, but you're welcome to join me there tomorrow if you prefer." They sat together as David activated a holographic display showing various plant specimens. "These are the primary species we're studying on Colony Epsilon. They have remarkable adaptive properties, but they're extremely sensitive to bacterial contamination." Minji leaned forward, genuinely interested despite herself. "These are from Earth. Some are Earth hybrids, others are native to Epsilon. The challenge is creating stable cross-species grafts." David pointed to one delicate blue-vein specimen. "This one has medicinal properties but dies within minutes of handling." Minji studied the image carefully. "Verlaxians have natural antibacterial compounds in our skin. Is that why you?" She stopped, unsure how to phrase it. "Why I contracted you specifically," David finished for her. "Yes. Your species biology makes you uniquely qualified for this work. Your father didn't mention this." Minji shook her head. "He only sold my body for labor. He did not speak of any special skills." David's expression darkened. "Well, your biology gives you an advantage in xenobotany that few others possess. It's skilled work, not just labor." They ate in silence for a moment before Minji gathered her courage to ask a question. "On the station, you gave me my contract. No one does this for debt servants." David set down his utensil. "That's because I don't believe in debt servitude. On Earth, we have a dark history with slavery and indentured service. We learned those systems destroy both the enslaved and the enslaver." "But you purchased my contract," Minji said, confusion evident in her 4 eyes. "I hired you," David corrected gently. "Yes, I paid off your family's debt, but what I expect in return is professional work, not ownership of you. That's an important distinction." Minji considered this as she finished her meal. The concept was foreign to her experience. On Verlax, debt bondage was simply a fact of life. The debtor became property until the debt was paid, usually through years of uncompensated labor. Later that evening, Minji stood in the ship's observation deck, watching the stars streak by. The vastness of space made her feel small but somehow less trapped. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see David approach. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, standing beside her to look out at the stars. "Verlaxians require less sleep than humans," she explained. "I was thinking about what you said earlier." David waited patiently for her to continue. "On my world, once a debt bond is made, the servant has no rights, no choices," Minji said carefully. "They work until the debt is paid or they die. Their family receives updates on the debt reduction, but nothing more." "That's not how it works with me," David said firmly. "Your contract has specific terms, reasonable hours, and educational opportunities. When the 4 years are complete, you'll be free to choose your next steps with no further obligation." Minji's secondary eyes blinked rapidly, a sign of emotional processing in Verlaxians. "I do not understand why you would do this. It is not economically efficient." David laughed softly. "Perhaps not in the short term. But I found that people who work from choice rather than force do better work and live better lives. That seems efficient in a different way." The next week passed in a routine of meals, research discussions, and unexpected lessons. David taught Minji the basics of the lab equipment she would be using at the colony. She proved a quick study, her 4-fingered hands naturally dexterous and precise. During their 10th day of travel, the ship encountered a minor asteroid field. The sudden shuddering threw Minji off balance in the corridor. David caught her before she fell, his hand steadying her shoulders. "Are you all right?" he asked, quickly releasing her once she was stable. "Yes, thank you," she replied, surprised by the genuine concern in his voice. That night, Minji sat on her sleeping platform, holding the data chip containing her contract. She had read it multiple times now, still amazed by the provisions it contained: medical care, education credits, personal time, even a small stipend. For the first time since her father had announced her fate, Minji felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Not quite hope, but perhaps its precursor. Her body had been sold to clear a debt, but her mind remained her own. And this strange human seemed to value that mind more than the labor her body could provide. As the ship continued its journey toward Colony Epsilon, Minji began to wonder if this transaction might have unexpectedly sold her into something she had never experienced before: freedom. Colony Epsilon came into view through the ship's main viewport as a swirl of blue oceans and green-tinged landmasses. Minji stood beside David, her 4 eyes widening at the sight of her new home. The colony had been established 15 years ago, but had grown rapidly into one of the most successful human settlements in this sector. "It's beautiful," she whispered, the blue-green planet reflecting in her large primary eyes. "Wait until you see the valley," David said with a smile. "The research center is built where 3 ecosystems meet. The biodiversity is incredible." Their shuttle descended through wispy clouds toward a sprawling settlement nestled between rolling hills. Unlike the stark, angular architecture of Verlaxian cities, Colony Epsilon blended with its environment. Buildings curved with the landscape, many partially covered with native vegetation. As they landed, Minji noticed other non-humans moving among the colonists, more than she had expected. A Krell botanist with scale-like skin directed cargo. 2 Meridian traders with their distinctive silver hair negotiated with a human supplier. "There are many aliens here," she observed as they disembarked. "We prefer non-human residents," David corrected gently. "About 30% of our population comes from other worlds. Science has always been better when different perspectives work together." They boarded a ground transport that hummed quietly along a winding road. The settlement gradually gave way to less developed areas, though Minji noted carefully maintained paths and research stations dotting the landscape. "The Xenobotany Research Center," David announced as they crested a hill. The center spread before them, a collection of connected domes and low buildings partially embedded in the hillside. Expansive greenhouse structures caught the afternoon sunlight, their translucent surfaces glowing with activity inside. "This will be your home for the next 4 years," David said. "And this," he directed the transport toward a small cluster of residential units nestled among native trees, "is where you'll live." Minji had expected servants' quarters or dormitory housing. Instead, David led her to a private dwelling, small but complete with its own entrance garden filled with flowering plants. "This is mine?" she asked, unable to hide her shock as they entered the simple but comfortable space. "Your housing is part of your contract," David explained. "All research staff have private quarters. The lab often requires unusual hours, so we find it helps if people have their own space to rest." The unit contained a main room with comfortable seating, a sleeping area, food preparation space, and a hygiene chamber adapted for Verlaxian biology. Large windows overlooked a small stream that wound through the research center grounds. "The research facility is a short walk from here," David continued. "We'll begin orientation tomorrow. For today, settle in and rest." "Oh," he handed her a small device. "This is your personal tablet. It contains colony information, communication access, and your education portal." "Education portal," Minji repeated, taking the device carefully. "I've enrolled you in xenobiology courses through the colony's education network. The classes are flexible to work around lab schedules. Your contract includes education credits." Minji's secondary eyes blinked rapidly in shock. On Verlax, bonded servants are not educated. It is, she searched for the right word, forbidden. "You're not on Verlax," David replied simply. "And you're not a servant here. You're a research assistant with a 4-year contract. What you learn is yours to keep forever." After David left, Minji explored her new home in stunned silence. She ran her blue fingers over the furnishings, opened cabinets stocked with food appropriate for her biology, and finally sat by the window watching unfamiliar birds flit among trees. The next morning, Minji followed a path to the main research facility. The air smelled different from anything she had experienced, rich with plant life and the slight metallic tang unique to Colony Epsilon's soil composition. David met her at the entrance, ready to begin. The laboratory was a marvel of integrated technology and natural elements. Plants grew in carefully controlled environments, while researchers of various species moved between stations with purpose. David introduced her to the team, a mix of humans and non-humans who greeted her as a colleague rather than a servant. "Minji has unique antibacterial properties in her skin that make her perfect for handling our most sensitive specimens," David explained to the head researcher, Dr. Hannah Kim, a serious-looking human woman with gray-streaked hair. Dr. Kim nodded approvingly. "We've needed someone with your biology on our team. Let's see what you can do." Minji was led to a sealed chamber containing delicate blue-veined plants similar to those David had shown her on the ship. Under Dr. Kim's watchful eye, she carefully touched a leaf that other researchers could only handle with specialized equipment. The plant remained stable, its sensitive tissues undamaged by her touch. "Remarkable," Dr. Kim murmured, making notes on her tablet. "Your natural skin compounds prevent the bacterial shock that usually kills these specimens within minutes of contact." For the first time in her life, Minji felt valued for something unique to her, something no one could take away. Her family had sold her body as if it were just a tool for labor, never knowing that same body possessed abilities that made her not just useful but irreplaceable. That evening, Minji sat on a small bench outside her dwelling, watching Colony Epsilon's sun set behind distant hills. She activated her education tablet, scrolling through the xenobiology courses now available to her. Knowledge no one in her family had ever been permitted to access was now at her fingertips. She selected the first lesson and began to read, her mind expanding beyond the limited future she had once resigned herself to. Her body might have been sold, but here on this distant world, her mind was finding freedom. The seasons changed on Colony Epsilon, marking Minji's first year away from Verlax. She had grown confident in her work at the research facility, her hands performing delicate operations no other team member could manage. The xenobiology courses expanded her understanding, and she found herself suggesting improvements to experimental procedures that even senior researchers appreciated. One humid morning, alarms blared throughout the colony. Minji was carefully transplanting seedlings when the sound cut through the peaceful laboratory. Dr. Kim rushed into the room, her normally calm face tight with concern. "Emergency meeting in the main hall," she announced. "Everyone must attend." Researchers filed into the colony's central gathering space, where Administrator Chunho Lee stood on a raised platform. His expression was grave as he addressed the crowd. 3 hours ago, Survey Team 6 discovered an unusual fungal bloom in the Western Ravine, he began. 2 team members made direct contact. They are now in medical isolation with spreading infections that are not responding to standard treatments. Murmurs rippled through the gathered colonists. Minji stood beside David, watching worry spread across faces. "The medical team has identified the pathogen as a mutated strain of the native EP117 fungus," Administrator Lee continued. "It appears to have evolved to attack non-native biological systems, specifically those of colonist species." Dr. Park, the colony's chief medical officer, stepped forward. "The infection moves quickly. We've contained the initial cases, but 4 more colonists who had secondary contact are now showing symptoms. Our standard antifungal treatments are ineffective." David leaned closer to Minji. EP117 was considered harmless to non-native life forms. This mutation is unexpected. Administrator Lee raised his hands for quiet. "We've sent emergency signals to the nearest Federation outposts, but the closest medical ship is 8 days away. We need solutions now." Dr. Park consulted her tablet. "We're exploring all options. One possibility involves Verlaxian antibacterial compounds, which preliminary tests suggest might slow the fungal spread. We need volunteers who can help synthesize a treatment." Minji felt dozens of eyes turned toward her. The colony's only Verlaxian resident. Her 4 eyes blinked rapidly as she processed this information. No one spoke, but the expectation hung in the air. David touched her arm gently. "This is not part of your contract. No one would blame you for." "I volunteer," Minji said, her voice clear and steady as she stepped forward. The words surprised even her. Dr. Park nodded briskly. "Come with me to the medical facility." The medical center bustled with frantic activity. Through observation windows, Minji saw the first victims, their skin mottled with spreading green-black patches. Dr. Park led her to a laboratory section where medical researchers worked at various stations. "We need to extract specific compounds from your epidermal cells," Dr. Park explained. "The process isn't dangerous, but it will be uncomfortable." "How many samples do you need?" Minji asked. Dr. Park's expression was grim. "As many as you can safely provide. Each treatment requires fresh extracts." The procedure began with Minji seated in a specialized chair as medical technicians applied extraction devices to her arms. The sensation was like thousands of tiny needles being pressed into her skin simultaneously. She controlled her breathing, focusing on the ceiling tiles rather than the pain. Hours passed. The extraction sites became increasingly sensitive, but Minji insisted on continuing. When Dr. Park suggested a rest period, she refused. "The infected colonists cannot rest," she said simply. By nightfall, the medical team had developed a preliminary treatment using Minji's cellular compounds. She watched through an observation window as they administered it to the first victims. The progression of the fungal infection visibly slowed, though it did not stop entirely. "It's working," Dr. Park said, relief evident in her voice. "Not a cure, but it buys us time until the medical ship arrives." For 3 days, Minji endured repeated extraction procedures. Her blue skin became pale and sensitive, her energy depleted. Yet each morning she returned to the medical center without complaint. Between procedures, she rested in a recovery ward, her body working to replace what was being taken. On the 3rd evening, David found her in the recovery room. Her normally vibrant blue skin had taken on a grayish tone, and her 4 eyes were dull with exhaustion. He sat beside her bed, concern etched across his face. "The last 2 infected colonists are responding well to treatment," he told her. "Dr. Park says we can reduce the extraction schedule." The worst is over. Minji nodded weakly. I am glad. David was quiet for a moment. You risked your health for strangers. That wasn't in your contract. Minji turned her head to look at him, her large primary eyes focusing with effort. You showed me I am more than property, that my body is my own to give freely. Is this not what freedom means? The choice to help others. David's eyes glistened with unexpected emotion. That's exactly what it means. 2 days later, Minji was strong enough to leave the medical facility. As she walked slowly toward her dwelling, colonists stopped to thank her. Some bowed respectfully in the Earth Asian tradition. Others placed their hands over their hearts in universal gratitude. Administrator Lee himself came to her home that evening, presenting her with a formal commendation for her service to the colony. Your actions saved 7 lives directly and prevented a potential colony-wide crisis, he said. We are in your debt. Minji accepted the commendation with quiet dignity. Long after the administrator left, she sat looking at the official document with its gold seal and signatures. Her family had sold her body as if it were their property to trade. But here, among these humans, she had discovered something profound. Her body was her own, and the choice to use it in service of others was a freedom she had never imagined possible. The morning air carried a sweet scent from the flowering trees surrounding the administrative center of Colony Epsilon. Minji stood on the steps, her blue skin contrasting with the formal white clothing she had chosen for this important day. 3 years had passed since the fungal crisis, and today marked the completion of her 4-year contract. Inside her pocket, she carried the small data chip David had given her on the day she left Nexus Station, the chip containing the contract that had both bound and freed her. Though she had long memorized its contents, she kept it as a reminder of how her journey had begun. David waited for her at the entrance, dressed more formally than usual. Are you ready? He asked with a smile. Minji nodded, her 4 eyes clear and confident. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been sold to clear a family debt. Her time on Colony Epsilon had transformed her into someone she never imagined becoming, a respected research specialist whose work on plant-based remedies had earned recognition throughout the Federation science community. They entered the administrative building together. The contract termination process was held in a bright room overlooking the colony's central garden. Administrator Lee and a legal officer were already waiting, along with Dr. Kim from the research facility. Minji of Clan Yun. Administrator Lee began officially. Today marks the completion of your 4-year labor contract with Colony Epsilon Research Division. All terms have been fulfilled. The legal officer placed a document reader on the table. Please verify your identity for the final processing. Minji placed her palm on the reader, feeling the warm tingle as it scanned her genetic signature. The screen displayed her contract details with a large green completed status indicator. The contract is fulfilled, the legal officer announced. All debt obligations have been satisfied. Full legal documentation has been filed with both Federation Labor Authority and Verlaxian Central Registry. David stepped forward, presenting Minji with a small case containing several official documents. Your liberation papers, he said. Your family's debt has been cleared with interest. You are free of all obligations. Minji accepted the case, her fingers slightly trembling. The moment felt simultaneously momentous and strangely ordinary. 4 years of her life exchanged for her family's financial mistakes. Yet those years had given her something no one in her family possessed: education, skills, and true independence. You have options now, Administrator Lee said, placing 3 data tablets on the table. The Xenobotany Institute has offered you a permanent research position with full benefits and citizenship eligibility. Earth universities have scholarship programs for non-human specialists in your field, or there's passage to any Federation world you choose, including return to Verlax if you wish. Minji looked at the 3 tablets representing her possible futures. A message notification from her family had arrived the previous day. Their first contact in 4 years. They had expressed satisfaction that her service had cleared their debt and suggested she return home to resume her proper place in the family unit. I have considered all options carefully, Minji said, her voice steady. She picked up the first tablet. I choose to stay on Colony Epsilon and accept the research physician. Dr. Kim smiled approvingly. We're pleased to have you join our permanent staff. Your work with hybrid medicinal plants has already advanced our research significantly. Minji completed the necessary documentation, her signature transforming her status from contracted worker to colony resident with career specialist designation. The process took less than 10 minutes to legally alter the course of her entire life. As they left the administrative building, David walked with her through the central garden. Colorful native plants thrived alongside carefully introduced Earth species, a successful integration of different worlds. How does it feel? David asked as they paused by a fountain. Minji considered the question carefully. When my father sold my contract, I believed my life was over. I would work until the debt was paid, then return to a family who saw me as property. That was the only future I could imagine. She touched a delicate blue flower, one of the specimens she had helped stabilize through her unique ability to handle sensitive plant life. My family sold my body for their debts, she continued, but they never owned my mind or my future. You helped me discover that. David nodded thoughtfully. So what happens next? The research team is already excited about your proposal for the new medicinal hybrid project. I will continue my work and my studies, Minji said with quiet determination. There is much more to learn. And perhaps someday I will help change the debt servitude customs on my homeworld. That evening, Minji stood on the small porch of her dwelling, no longer temporary housing, but now her permanent home. The twin moons of Colony Epsilon cast silver light across the research center's grounds. She opened her communication tablet and composed a brief message to her family on distant Furlax. Contract complete. Debt cleared. I will not be returning. I have chosen a different path. After sending the message, Minji looked up at the unfamiliar stars that had become her stars, the strange world that had become her world. 4 years ago, her father had treated her as property to be sold. Now she stood as proof that paths could change, that contracts could end, and that sometimes being sold could lead to being saved. Her body had been traded in a transaction her family considered final, but her soul had found liberation among people who saw her not as property, but as a person with gifts to offer and choices to make. And that made all the difference.